Reverend Alexandra Sangster has been working as a minister of the Word with the Uniting Church in Australia for over 15 years and as an actor and facilitator for over 20 years. She has taught at the National Theatre, the Centre for Theology and Ministry and Whitley College, and has facilitated many retreats and workshops in both corporate and community sectors designed to awaken, inspire and challenge. Alex is passionate about breaking open the story in ways that liberate, inspire and awaken, and in ways which create connections with the emerging church and those who are spiritually hungry but culturally anti-institution. She works as an activist with Love Makes a Way and the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, and most recently has been arrested while blocking the gates at the Adani front line. She also writes a progressive Christian podcast and is an actor and facilitator with the Melbourne Playback Theatre. So for both our speakers, I think the two questions that we want them to answer is to tell us a little bit about their activism and how they relate their theology with their activism, and also how they see activism in a post-coronavirus world and where that will lead us. So Alex, over to you. You need to unmute yourself though first.
Yeah, sure. G'day everyone. Look, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I must admit, my sort of heart rose in my chest at the idea of speaking for 20 to 25 minutes. I think that would be most exhausting for everyone listening. Jonathan and I had a quick chat earlier today and thought that maybe we would try and speak for about 10 to 15, see how we go. And, you know, I'm actually quite happy for, you know, people to, if you do have questions, obviously, like, you know, write them down but I'd be very much interested in having this more as a conversation space than me. I am a preacher. I can go on for hours, I promise you, but I think it would be more fun for all of us in this strange Zoom space to have a bit more of a conversation if we can. And I know that's tricky with tech, but we'll give it a red hot go. So I'll share with you a little bit now about myself and about my journey. But before I do, I'd just like to ask you, and I know I can't see everyone on my screen, but you can just participate anyway. Could I just ask how many of you that are gathered here today, how many of you have ever signed a petition? If you have, okay, we've got quite a few hands going up there. Great. Okay, so hands up if you have ever been like on a protest march, like on a rally of some kind. Yep, we've got quite a few hands there. That's great. Hands up if you've ever been involved in an act of non-violent direct action, NVDA. Has anyone ever done any? Yep, we've got a couple of hands there. Fantastic. Whoa, more hands going up. And hands up if you've ever been arrested or broken the law for your faith. Okay, all right. Look at a little half hand there. I'll be interested in finding out more about that story later on. So let me tell you a story. There are so many stories, but let me tell you one of many. In Pakistan, in the summer of 2016, people dug mass graves in advance of a predicted heat wave. So this is back in 2016. In West Roxbury, USA, in 2016, climate activists, including many people of faith, also dug mass graves. They were digging these graves in solidarity with the people in Pakistan. They were also digging to disrupt a massive fracking gas pipeline project. So the anti-pipeline project, this movement began in 2015 when an energy company broke ground on a 5-mile-long extension. Now, this is just one story in the myriad of stories of direct activism and faith around the world. The company had recently just been fined, the company that had been digging for oil, after hundreds and thousands of gallons of crude oil spilled into the Kalamazoo River. And despite the city leaders opposing the extension, though, the government issued them a permit. The company proceeded to dig up the roads. And when it became really clear that the legal means of protesting weren't working, petitions, public comments, strikes, marches, ongoing challenges against the permit in the federal court, an organisation called the Climate Disobedience Centre started training hundreds of protesters. 1970s veterans of anti-war and anti-nuclear demonstrations joined in. We might have some of you gathered in this conversation today. And all of these people of faith and non-faith, they dug graves and they lay down in them. And over the course of about 30 actions, these protesters sat down in front of backhoes, they chained themselves to fences, they dropped into pipelines, trenches, they decorated it with flowers, and they prayed, and they sang, and they sang. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. You all know how it goes. So over the course of this time, with all of this action, there was a lot of media attention, and people were saying, what are you doing? Like there were clergy with dog collars, and there were rabbis, and there were nuns, and people were astonished that people of faith were laying down in these graves and singing these songs. But one of the activists, Reverend Maria White Hammond, a climate justice activist and also a minister who was at the Graves protest, said, I am here today because I believe that we can lay to rest the spirit of exploitation that has brought us to this terrible place. And another reverend also said, we recognise that trenches like the ones being dug in Pakistan were caused by the trenches that we were resisting in West Roxbury. So everything is connected. And if we have learnt nothing else from this terrible virus that is gripping the world at this moment, we have learnt this. Everything is connected. The heart in our bodies is the meeting place of blood and soul and pulse and breath. And so one of the questions that we're looking at together here today is, what is at the heart of our faith? What is our touchstone? Why are we here right now? And when we look at Christianity and Judaism and other spiritual traditions, there's always the does it even matter question. Why do we do what we do? And what strength and energy do we draw upon? For myself, and for hundreds and thousands of other folk of faith and non-folk, there is a growing awareness that non-violent direct action is one of the most effective ways to fight injustice. There's, most recently, Jonathan and I have been involved in the Stop Adani campaign. And this has seen countless hours of work, and for myself it's involved, I've been to Queensland 3 times now, once with Jonathan to hand in a petition, and he may say some more about that later, and twice now to stand at the gate. This, involves sort of, traveling this vast distance, getting up at 4 a.m, driving along bumpy roads with other activists who have been giving their lives to fight this cause. And when I say giving their lives, I don't mean giving their lives in the way that some climate activists across the world in the developing countries are literally giving their lives, but I mean giving their time and their energy and their passion, and they move their families up there, and this is what they do. They've made a commitment to stop this mine. There's so many things I could say. So this work of prophetic witness that all these folk are engaged in, for me is perhaps best embodied by the ministry of someone called Martin Luther King Jr. You may or may not have heard of him before. In the words of my fellow activist, Justin Whelan, who is one of the founding members of Love Makes a Way, another group that I'm involved in, King's speeches and sermons are well known, but as time passes, his role as a dangerous radical activist who was arrested time and time again is at risk of being sidelined. But King's words would have meant little if they were not if they were not written from a jail cell or spoken at the head of a protest march or preached on the day before he was assassinated. It was his actions and those of tens of thousands of others on the front lines of protest, facing down water cannons and police dogs, that dramatised the injustice and forced change. More, however, it was the disciplined, non-violent nature of this protest that spoke powerfully of an alternative vision in a way that violence could not. So in Australia right now, we have been standing up against immoral environmental policies, because in Australia right now, we are at a tipping point. In Australia right now, we are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. My activism, though, did not begin with our planet, but began with her people. My first experience of working in the NVDA space was standing up for the rights of asylum seekers. And I did this using my body and using prayer. And there's an amazing Lakota woman, Layli Long Soldier. She's a poet and an activist. And while there was the protest going on at Standing Rock that about another pipeline, some of you may have seen that a few years ago, she wrote of how she had been thinking a lot about the place of prayer and faith in protest. She said, "My friends in Standing Rock have insisted on prayer as being part of the primary tool for resistance. Prayer is central to everything they do. It is an energy and it is a force." And in the words of another Lakota woman, White Bull, she writes, "The highest weapon of them all is prayer." And she then goes on to explain, "The world is watching. Our ancestors are watching. My children are watching. And we are fighting for the human race." So I offer this little introduction to you now as an activist who uses prayer as power, who believes from my faith tradition that Jesus was a radical subversive who used everything he could, apart from violence, to try and change the world. Justin Whelan, who I mentioned before, explains that Love Makes a Way was born out of the question, if you honestly thought your government was perpetrating evil, how far would you go to stop them? Now, we often look back to Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa and ask why more people did not resist the atrocities committed in their name. These cases illustrate a basic truth. There are times when resisting your own government or resisting the rules of the state or resisting big business, which is in the government's pocket and vice versa, is not only justified, it's morally necessary. So my question has been, when it comes to the environment and when it comes to asylum seekers, is this one of those times? And after much discussion and prayer and examination of my conscience and talking with my colleagues, I decided that the answer was yes. So I hope that gives you a little insight into the motivations behind the journey that I am on. For those who don't know much about the Uniting Church, I'm ordained as something called the Minister of the Word. That means when I was ordained, which was over 15 years ago, I was ordained to be a pastor, a priest, and a prophet. So the pastoral care, that's about loving your people and having cups of tea and holding babies and doing the garden. The priestly work is the priestly functions of breaking bread and baptizing and burying. The prophetic work, to be a prophet, which is to stand with all the great prophets throughout history from all many different faith traditions. That's the work that I probably feel most strongly called to, and which I've been very blessed to have a church congregation that has supported me in that work. So I think that's probably enough. I'm going to stop now and hand back over to Alex and see where he wants to go from here.
Thank you, fellow Alex.